priority list of activities across the site. Sorry about that.
Start that.
And basically, as Bill mentioned, the 5-year plan really summarizes our execution of that. And there's a integration of this with ongoing public outreach and stakeholder input to feed into this process. We are prioritizing our activities and the mission, based on our overall mission to clean up the Hanford site, based on risk prioritizations, our consent decree requirements, and our tri-party agreements with our regulators. We look at the priorities and how we prioritize what we do now versus later, and look at the impact on workforce safety, community safety, environmental risks, the life cycle cost and the challenges associated with get the work done in a manner that maximizes the risk reduction. We operate in a constrained environment, fiscally constrained on a year basis based on the congressional appropriation process, and are planning our work and our priorities within those constraints. The focus really is to use those resources to effectively positively impact the environment and progress the Hanford site cleanup. With that process, so let's step to the next slide, please. So many of you have probably seen our overall priorities before. They remained fairly constant over time. Delivery of safe and secure operations across the site is our primary mission. Manage and treat and dispose of the tank waste that's in the tank farms. Stabilizing the aging structures that are across the site. Demolish retired facilities, remediate waste sites, and treat the contaminated groundwater. As Bill will share later, we treat up to 2.5 billion gallons a year in groundwater, which is a key aspect to the long-term mission execution. And lastly, but as importantly, we'll talk a little bit about the infrastructure that we need to maintain across the site to support all these important cleanup activities and ensure we have the water, the medical, the fire systems to continue this work. Next slide, please. So now I'll switch gears and talk really specifically on the Office of River Protection budget profile. I think as most folks are aware, we are operating under single manager, but we still have 2 offices and we still operate under 2 distinct budget profiles. And this is the Office of River Protection's profile, which is the tank farms mission and the waste treatment plant construction. If we would have been talking a day or two ago, 22 would have been the president's budget. We just recently, in the last day or two, got a full year of appropriations approved through Congress. So these are our fiscal year 22 enacted numbers. We had been in continuing resolutions, i.e. short-term funding, up to this point this year. So if you look at it, PBS 14, which is really all of the tank farm operations, radioactive liquid tank waste, stabilization and disposition is $837 million. Just as a reference, that's about $20 million more than the president's budget was. One sub-element of that is ORP 14A, which is the low-level waste offsite disposal, also probably better known as Test Bed Initiative. This is the last increment of funding for the phase 2, the 2,000-gallon demonstration POS of that. So no further funding will be needed in the out years for that activity. So that's about $844 million for ORP 14. I'll go switch into the bottom of the slide, ORP 70. That's a funding source for WTP operations. That's really defined from the start of hot commissioning of the plant going forward. But this year we have, again, about $50 million. That's been fairly consistent. What we're doing with this in 22 is funding spare parts, long lead items, so melters 2 and 3, containers, and supplies that are long lead to support the long-term operations of the waste treatment plant after Bechtel finishes the commissioning activities. And then I'll jump back up to the middle, and there we have the waste treatment plant project itself as ORP 0060. The lab law and balance of facilities, that's what LBL stands for, and the direct feed law and the WTP side is fully funded there at the $586 million. And you'll also see under ORP 60, high-level waste was a separate control point at the congressional level at 144 million. This is a significant increase in that amount. And again, if you'd looked at the president's request, that's about an $84 million increase over that. And then lastly, the ongoing preservations of pretreatment at 20 million. So really that leaves an overall budget for the ORP side about 1.645 billion. So fairly appropriate recognition of the important work that we're doing across the site. Next slide, please. So now I'll take a couple seconds to run through some of the stuff that we're planning to do with this budget and what we're doing in 22 and 23 to prepare for that. So one of the key aspects of our mission is the direct feed low activity waste in the 22, 23, and 24 timeline. And this slide really is a summary of the day in the life to kind of explain how all those pieces work across the site and across all of our contractors. So if you look at the graphic and kind of start at the bottom right where it says it all starts here, it all starts there. That's our single shell tanks get retrieved and forwarded into our double shell tanks. We're staging waste in AP 105, and we have staged waste in AP 107 that's been sampled and basically feeding the tank side season removal system. And I'm happy to note that as of January, we've initiated operations of we call it TSCR, tank side season removal system. And as of right now, we've completed treating 197,000 gallons of waste, and we're actually in the first cycle of changing out the ion exchange columns, the continuing process. Our goal is to pre-treat up to 1 million gallons, and that's being staged in the center of your picture in AP 106. This is our newest double shell tank farm, and in preparations to feed the low activity waste facility in the WTB plant as they start up in the 23 and 24 time period. When they are operating, we'll be feeding about 8,000 gallons per day to the fluid management facility, which is in the top right of your picture. That's the receipt of the treated waste. After WTB gets operational, that'll be fed to the 2 melters, classified at 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. It will be producing about 3.5 canisters per day. They'll be placed on our immobilized transporters and go to the integrated disposal facility on site about 1.5 miles away. We're talking about 5 canisters per day, and that's actually done by one of the other site contractors, that facility, and they'll be disposed of in that facility. The other main aspect of the operations is a secondary liquid waste stream, and you'll see that in the top of the picture, about 45,000 to 95,000 gallons, 1 or 2 times a week will be transitioned to our retention bases and treated in the effluent treatment facility, which you see on the bottom right. That will basically treat the water. The treated materials from that will go into the integrated disposal facility, and the liquid is basically be released at the drinking water standards in a permitted release point. That all operations is supported by the 222S laboratory, which you see on the bottom left, which does all the tank farm sampling, and WTP has an integrated laboratory, the waste treatment laboratory, which is there in the middle on the top, that keeps the WTP plant operating. The rest of the graphic really shows that we're dependent on emergency response, power, sewers, roads, patrol across the site that are all essential to this integrated operation. So that's really the components of the integrated activities that we're working toward to achieve the DFLAW treatment in the 2024 time window and the period that we're asking your guys' input for. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'll focus a little bit more on the tank farm specific activities in this time period to give you a perspective of the larger picture beyond DFLAW operations. Although that's key to all of us, it's no means the only activities that we're doing across the site, including tank farms. So to give you a perspective, and the graphic here just shows you the WTP perspective and the tank farms aerial overview. But as I mentioned already this year, TSCR is operational, a tank waste season removal system. and we have 2,000 gallons of material already pre-treated, ready for WTP treatment, and continue that operation. We continue to retrieve single shell tanks to our double shell tank farms. AX103 is currently in progress, and we're prepping for the third tank farm to be retrieved, which is A farm. So we have lots of preparatory activities ongoing, digging, putting in power supplies, and cleaning out pits to enable those operations in 24. In 23, we'll progress the low activity waste melter construction and startup process, getting to operational readiness. We'll be in tank farms, updating the 242A evaporator to bring it back up online to manage double shell tank space and allow continued single shell tank retrievals, upgrading the effluent treatment facility that treats the secondary waste to support WTP hot commissioning, and we're building a new LRF basin that will provide us additional storage to again support DFLAW operations and the path forward. In 23, we'll be starting the last of the AX farm tanks, AX104. So that will be the beginning of the second full farm of tanks removed or were retrieved from the single shell tanks to the double shell tanks. Remember, we had finished C farm already. In 2024, just to give you perspective, as I mentioned, we'll have AX farm done. And you can see AX farm is up there in the middle of the picture above the WTP part in the east area. The A farm is there right next to it. We'll be getting the first A farm retrieval in A101. This will be the third farm that we are beginning retrieving of, with the AX and AC done by that point. WTP waste treatment will have completed their ORR and be in operations, and we'll be feeding that 8,000 gallons per day out of the DST system to be treated and disposed of in the IDF. TSCR will be continuing to run to support that. We'll be mitigating some risk in the west area with limited double shell tank space to keep the 222S laboratory running, and completing all the paperwork activities and working with Ecology to align on completion of the AX farm retrievals. And finally, we'll be completing the fourth of our tank farm barriers for our single shell tank. U farm barrier will complete in 2024, just to give you some sense of the activities that'll be occurring in addition to the double shell tank, the DFLAW operations that begin in 2024. An exciting period of time where we have, as of this year, initiated tank waste treatment for the first time. We're treating waste that are supporting for final disposition, which is historical first. And by 2024, we'll be operating the WTP plant, producing glass to begin the waste treatment mission and moving forward for our mission completion. With that, I'll turn it over to Roger to give you a quick update on the specifics associated with the waste treatment plant.
Thanks, Omar. This is Roger Gordon. I work with Tom Fletcher in the waste treatment plant. He's the assistant manager for that project. Currently, the slide you have on the screen, the left slide is the low activity waste facility. That's a current, fairly current picture of the facility. And on the right is the high level waste facility as it looks today as well. Currently, for FY22, we are, for the low activity waste facility, we're working on completing the water runs for the melter feed system. And then we're also making preparations for starting up the first melter. And after successful completion of that, we'll move over and start up the second melter. For FY23, we'll start off with the coal commissioning management assessment by the contractor. And following that, we'll go into coal commissioning activities, which is a major milestone for the facility. After completing that, then we get into the operational readiness review. So the contractor will do theirs first, and then DOE will come in afterwards, and we'll complete an independent operational readiness review following that. In FY24, the goal is to get into hot commissioning activities, and then successful completion of that will get into approval to start up and then get into operations of the low activity waste facility. For the high-level waste facility, currently we're working on design reviews. We are currently completing a number of 60% design reviews for a number of systems. And for FY23, we plan on continuing with design of a number of systems for the HLW systems. And for FY24, we will continue with design, but we will also be starting limited resumption of construction activities at the HLW facility. So that's the plan for those two facilities for 23 and for 24. So with that, I will turn it over to Bill, and we'll switch over to Richland.
Okay. All right. You can see here's the Richland Operations Office budget. As Delmar mentioned, the FY22 enacted budget is new. We just got that the other day. So we are looking at that, putting together our spend plans and working on that. You can see the two categories here: Central Plateau remediation, then the river corridor and other cleanup operations. And underneath there's a couple of key areas worthy of note that you'll hear about later on tonight. You can see the line item in infrastructure, the 400 area fire station, and the Central Plateau water treatment facility. Brian Harkins will talk about those. There's also a line item for WESF modification and capsule storage. That also is a line item portion of the bigger cesium and strontium capsule project. Safeguards and security is a key aspect of our infrastructure support. There's the fast flux test facility, D&D and maintenance of that facility. Then, of course, we have the Richland community and regulatory support. Overall, the budget is approximately a little bit over $1 billion. So moving on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to walk through kind of the photographs here. These are some of our key FY24 risk reduction activities. And what you see here is you see up in the upper left-hand corner, you see the Building 324 project. And that consists of removing highly contaminated soil from beneath the facility. There's really three key aspects of this project. The first one is to clean out the hot cell. The second one is to basically prop the hot cell up with micropiles so that it's stable so we can get underneath it. The third part is to get underneath it and remove the contaminated soil from beneath the hot cells. So in 22, currently, we have installed 6 of the 22 micropiles to date. And in March, late March, we're going to actually start stabilizing the soil around the B cell by injecting grout outside the facility, and that basically will prevent loose soil from sloughing into the excavation as we remove soil. In February, we did make our first airlock entry since November, and we basically went into repair equipment and basically prep it for removal of B cell equipment and debris. In 23, leading up to 24, we're going to complete the installation of the 22 micropiles about the August time period. It is important to note that this schedule may be accelerated because we have an engineering analysis that may reduce the number of micropiles that we need to support the facility, but that is undergoing review by DOE. So that may go down as low as 13. So once we have that done, we're going to then basically stabilize the facility by basically attaching the micropiles to the cell. We'll do that in 24, and then we will also go in and remove debris from the B cell in 24. The goal is to start the B cell floor removal in April of 2024, and then start the excavation of the highly contaminated soil a little past fiscal year 24 in October of 2024, realizing that might be accelerated a little bit. As a follow-on, the excavation is intended to be completed in August of 2025, so that 2024 scope is important for us to do in that time period. A quick explanation of the pictures. If you look at the top left picture, that is the mock-up facility. You can see there basically the excavator in there. That is a clean environment where the operators go in and they train on that. They work on their proficiency. they work on procedures, they work on the equipment setup. Because it is a clean environment, they can actually make entries and make adjustments as they need to without obviously taking any contamination or any risk with respect to radiation. So that's a perfect practice facility for that. The second picture you see the actual structural modifications. The drill crews are in there, and they're doing installation of micropiles around the hot cell. These are, again, micropiles are basically columns that will support the walls and the facility when we go in to excavate. So that is the building 324 work scope. Over to the side, you see what we call WESIF, or the Waste Encapsulation Storage Facility. That's the cesium strontium dry capsules, dry capsules that we're moving from wet storage to dry storage. That is a risk reduction project. Obviously, we want to get them out of the pool to minimize any potential leaks or spread of contamination. We will put them into shielded, safe, dry storage. In FY22, we are going to work on mock-up activities. We are working on them right now. Installation of the test equipment in the mock-up, the WESIF mock-up. In 23, we're going to complete facility modifications at WESIF based on the results of the mock-up. And in FY24, we're going to basically put the capsule transfer equipment in its final state in the WESIF facility. The top rightmost picture is a picture of the automatic welding system. That's basically the welding system that's used to basically seal the canisters. And the second is the actual crane that will support that welding equipment when it's actually in use. We do not have a picture of the K basin here, but we have a number of activities that will be ongoing in the 2024. The most notable activity there is we're going to complete the grouting. Leading up to that, in January of 23, we're going to complete installation of the dewatering and the grouting systems. We'll complete the basin dewatering by September of 2023. Then we'll go into completing the grouting in 2024. So that is important. In addition to that, we'll have a number of selected waste sites in the area being cleaned up in support of that. And also, in addition to that, we'll be working on the safe, secure enclosure for the K-East reactor. But we do intend to have that done beforehand, and we'll complete that and have that done in the 2023 time period, turning that over to surveillance and maintenance activities. We also have, not shown here, the integrated disposal facility. Delmar covered that as the facility where we put the low activity waste canisters for disposal once they come out of the LAW facility. So that will be ready to start operations in 2024, and that will support the DF Law initiative. Shown also at the lower right side is the groundwater, some groundwater activities in the 200 West pump and treat. And this is part of the entire groundwater treatment system, which has a number of pump and treats, a number of wells, extraction wells, and monitoring wells. And, this is an important activity we plan on in 2024, like we do every year, to treat approximately 2.5 billion gallons of groundwater. That equates to roughly about 86 kilograms of chrome removed, 1,800 kilograms of carbon tetrachloride, about 100 kilograms of uranium, and about 2.17 exponential plus 12 picocuries of Tech-99, which is a highly radioactive substance. So that's our groundwater treatment facility in 2024. In addition to that, for waste programs, we will be beginning the initiation of certification activities for true waste shipment to WIP. It's going to be a mainly paperwork preparation, but it's important to get the preparations for that moving to support the 2028 date. In addition to that, we're going to continue shipment of true for repackaging to Pacific Northwest. We will continue ERDF, that's our big disposal cell operations, and we plan on completing the supercell design for the next supercell in 2024. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Harkins for infrastructure.
Next slide, please. So the infrastructure activities are about ensuring that we have the support necessary to support the Hanford cleanup mission for the future. Starting from the pictures at the top left-hand corner, the infrastructure supports of public safety. You see the firefighters doing a training at the Hammer facility there. And if you noted in the RL budget, there was an appropriation in fiscal year 22 for a new fire station in the 400 area. As the Hanford mission continues, the footprint is shrinking and changing. And as we do that, we sometimes see opportunities like this to be able to reduce the cost by relocating the fire services to where they're needed. The next picture, moving to the right top, is the long-term stewardship and environmental monitoring functions that are ongoing activities across the Hanford site. Fleet maintenance services, maintaining all of the equipment that we use out on the site, and the crane services that we provide for the site. Top right-hand corner is some pictures from some work that was recently done to relocate some of our telecommunication systems, to move them away from cultural sensitive sites, specifically the Gable Mountain activities, and to build capacity in the system to handle the additional workers that are needed for the cleanup activities in the future. Moving down to the bottom right-hand corner, you see some pictures of work going on to replace power poles. So one of the things that goes with infrastructure is that we have varying degrees of life expectancy in our systems. And some of these systems are now getting to the end of life, in this case, power poles, and we're having to go through and replace the power poles to ensure their reliability as we continue the mission. Moving across the left, you see some of the work that is ongoing for the sewer systems, as we, again, improve both the reliability as well as the capacity for support of the new personnel and activities going on out on site. In the middle and the bottom, you see some of the industrial and cybersecurity pictures. In this case, it's cybersecurity areas. That is unfortunately a part of our times that we live in, that cybersecurity is a real emphasis right now as we protect the site from a malicious attack. The next picture to the left is roads. And as we look at the road usage, we not only need to maintain the roads in good conditions to support the cleanup missions, but there are necessary upgrades as we look at traffic flows and safety on site. And so there are anticipated construction activities that will change the roads to better support the mission, specifically in the 200 area plateau area. And finally, on the bottom left-hand, you see a picture of the safeguards and securities. Very important function for the site to ensure that the people and the materials on site are protected from any malicious behavior. So with that, I will turn it back to Dana.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank our gentlemen for all of their hard work. I know it's a large undertaking to put all of this together, to collaborate, to explain it to us, and we appreciate all of your hard work very much. Next, we'll call on EPA for regulator perspective. And Dave Enan, are you on the phone? Can you join us, please?
I am on the phone, if I can just make sure I've got the mute button off.
I can hear you just fine, Dave.
Great. I'm going to actually go ahead and turn my camera on. Although a bit backlit, I'm afraid, so maybe that's not very helpful. Anyway, again, good evening. I'm Dave Enan with EPA Region 10, and I want to add my welcome and thanks for being here with us. I want to quickly share our priorities and some perspectives, but I'm going to keep my remarks short because I think the purpose of this meeting is to allow time for you, the public. You know, one thing that I'd like us all to keep in mind about priorities is the question isn't if, but when. All of the work, all of this cleanup has to happen, but it just can't happen all at once. And so be thinking about that as you give comments. And so, you know, EPA's priority remains to finish the cleanup, the risk reduction in the river corridor, including getting the groundwater actions in place, and then start to pivot to the central plateau. And coming in FY24, we're seeing more of that. Most of the river corridor will be done. You know, there's the 324 building that Bill mentioned. There's still some work in K. There's the 61811 burial ground, but we're going to be moving that focus more and more to the central plateau, and we're going to be looking for a mix of both waste site investigations and the cleanup actions, because we want to make sure we're still making progress, but we also want to make sure that we're getting tangible results and that we're getting the decisions in place for the next cleanups, so that we don't have to. We've always got something to do. And maintain the progress. You know, one of the things out there is the life cycle baseline report, and I will just kind of wanted to put a plug in that, you know, while we had hoped for a little bit more detail on the cleanup work. The schedules and cost estimates in the life cycle report don't always show the detail about how and when, and it's got more of a focus on geographic areas than we've had in the past, and so it's hard to tease out when and where things are happening and how much they cost. But like I said, I wanted to keep it short, so I'm going to stop there to make sure we leave time to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We appreciate your time very much and for bringing thoughts to share with us. And let's go ahead and pull up Ecology's presentation. John, I see you here, and thank you for joining us. And as soon as we get your slides up, we'll begin. We appreciate you joining us and explaining. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm John Price. I'm the Tri-Party Agreement Section Manager for Ecology, and I just want to start out by acknowledging all the great work described in the DOE presentation. You know, I personally especially like the amount of contaminants removed from the groundwater that Bill Hamill mentioned, the single shell tank retrievals in the AX farm, and the start of the direct feed low activity waste building. Those are all, you know, great achievements. And I think, you know, as a regulator, a lot of times we gloss over the achievements. We want more, you know, want to do it faster or better. So just wanted to start out on that positive note. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So Ecology wants to look at about a 5-year window looking ahead to comment on priorities. We used to be able to get that information. We think from DOE, we think the Hanford Tri-Party Agreement requires DOE to provide us with that level of detail over a 5-year period. We've had some conversations recently with DOE headquarters, with EPA involved as well. EPA headquarters tells us that they believe that executive privilege prevents DOE from providing the level of detail to Ecology and EPA that was formally provided. So I'm going to base my remarks tonight on the life cycle report that Dave Enan mentioned. It is the best available information we have. However, it does have some limitations. I'll point out a couple of those in my comments. And for example, one of the numbers I'll highlight for river corridor cleanup includes substantial cost and schedule uncertainty. That's a budget line item for DOE. And in a few places, I'm going to give you my personal opinion about the costs, and I have to provide personal opinion because I'm basing my remarks off analysis of the life cycle report rather than some of the information that DOE used to give Ecology and EPA. So where I'm giving you my personal opinion, I'll try and call that out. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So these are the Office of River Protection numbers from the life cycle report for 2023 in millions of dollars. The red number down there for pre-treatment is an example of how the life cycle report data has some limitations. If you remember the slides that DOE put up about the pre-treatment, it was a pretty small number, I think about $20 million. In the life cycle report for FY 2023, it shows up as over $1 billion. But we all know that DOE is not doing construction on the pre-treatment plant right now. So for purposes of evaluating the DOE budget, I went ahead and subtracted out that cost. So that's an example of one of the limitations of the life cycle report. And let's see, go ahead and go to the next slide. So we'll talk about the DOE Richland budget. So these are the Richland office costs for fiscal year 2023 from the life cycle report. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of costs included in the Richland budget that are actually not Hanford costs and maybe are not what you might think of as cleanup costs. So the first one I want to highlight, second number down, $135 million for safeguards and security. So Brian Harkins highlighted that. Definitely safeguards and security is a necessary part of the Hanford budget, and absolutely endorse what Mr. Harkins said about the cybersecurity requirements that are increasing. Very understandable. There has to be a lot of expenditure on that. But you'll also notice perhaps that that's a big number. It's about 10% of what Ecology thinks the compliance level funding request should be for DOE for FY 23. I've looked into those costs a little bit. I think about, and this is personal opinion, and I think about $50 million of those safeguards and security costs are for guarding nuclear materials that are still on site. So there's spent nuclear fuel on site, and there's also some materials owned by the DOE National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, that are not waste yet, but we anticipate will be waste at some point. So those materials definitely need to be guarded. Based on the life cycle report, guarding those is going to cost about $50 million a year for the next 40 years. So that's going to add up to about $2 billion life cycle for watching those materials. And I think it's worth noting also about 98% of the nuclear fuel that's stored at Hanford is from Hanford plutonium production. There is some non-Hanford material. There's fuel from 3 commercial power plants. There's some experimental fuel from Los Alamos National Laboratory, and some fuel from what's called a TRIGA reactor, and I won't spell out that acronym for you. So there's probably not any additional cost for guarding that 2% of the spent nuclear fuel in addition to Hanford fuel, but definitely the originators of those fuel are getting kind of a free ride as far as their safeguards and security costs. So I just did want to call that out. Let's see here. Another number I want to call out is you'll see the river corridor closure number, and that's from the life cycle report for fiscal year 23. That's a big portion of the Hanford budget. It's still about a sixth of the Hanford budget. For 2023, over 1/5 of that $208 million, so about $46 million, comes from what's called cost and schedule uncertainty. That's a number that's carried on all the different accounts in the life cycle report. It actually adds up to quite a bit of money. $46 million in a year is enough to pay for some substantial cleanup. You know, this meeting's about priorities. I don't know how we go about assigning a priority to cost and schedule uncertainty, but I did want to communicate to you that that's built into the cost estimates that we looked at. And then the last entry you see on the Hanford site on the page is the Hanford site-wide services. That's about a quarter of the FY 23 costs for DOE Richland. I think it's noteworthy that the Hanford Mission Integration Services contract includes $45 million for pensions and benefits for workers from other DOE sites. So that's an example of a non-Hanford cost that is included in the Hanford cleanup budget. Just thought that was worth noting as well. Let's go ahead and go to the last slide. So this, if you saw yesterday's Tri-City Herald, you may have noticed a headline stating Congress adopts record high budget to clean up Hanford. So if you look in the FY22 column in this table, you'll see that the appropriation number is $2.95 billion. That's a lot of money. And if you look across the row, absolutely, that's the highest appropriation that we've seen for Hanford. And of course, we definitely appreciate that level of appropriation. That'll get a lot of work done. You'll also notice the bottom line, which is the difference between the appropriation number and the compliance level request. And for FY22 and FY23, Ecology has estimated what that compliance level funding request is. We used to get notice of that compliance level funding request from DOE. They no longer provide it to us. And as I said earlier, we've heard from a DOE headquarters attorney that they believe that compliance level funding request is subject to executive privilege. So I just, so what's the impact of that appropriation shortfall, the difference number at the bottom line there? At this point, I haven't been able to estimate how that shortfall might affect the ORP mission to retrieve single shell tanks and treat tank waste. As I said earlier, there's good news. I agree coming up with the AX farm retrievals and the startup of the direct feed low activity waste building. I can tell you that at the Richland budget level, for the Richland budget at the appropriated funding levels, it's my opinion, and again, I'm giving you my opinion, that DOE Richland falls about a half year behind schedule every year that the appropriation is short that much from the compliance level funding request. So back in 2012, DOE itself said they were about 25 years behind schedule on the Hanford cleanup mission. And based on this appropriation level, which is a big number, they're going to continue to fall a little bit farther behind every year. So just a comparison. So that shortfall I said puts DOE Richland about a half year behind schedule every year that the shortfall occurs. On the other hand, we know from experience back in the mid 2010s that increasing up to the compliance level funding request does about twice as much work as is happening at the appropriated level. So why is that? How can you get more twice as much cleanup for a little bit of a plus up? Well, the reason is if you looked at the budget analysis, a lot of the costs in Richland are for site-wide services, safeguards, and security. Those are necessary services to support the cleanup, but they don't do any cleanup. So that's a little bit of a plus up would go a long ways for the Richland budget. Finally, my last words. So I just want to emphasize that Ecology holds the Hanford cleanup as one of the highest priorities in our agency. And we've got a lot of things we do across Washington. And just as an example, I'm representing Ecology here tonight because the director of Ecology, Director Watson, and my boss, the Nuclear Waste Program Manager, David Bowen, are currently in DC this week covering multiple issues, including the continued discussion on funding upcoming capital projects, brainstorming priorities like we've talked about tonight, and working towards a safe and effective cleanup at the Hanford site. So hopefully they'll bring back some good results from Washington, DC. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that very much. Now, I'm going a little off the cuff here, and I noticed that we talked about the life cycle schedule, both EPA and Ecology. I'm going to quickly try to share this with you if I can. I noticed that there are between 50 and 60 folks with us. And let me know if you can see my screen share. And maybe it's not going to come up. So, Patrick, you're fine to just keep the budget priorities clean up there. It's not going to allow me to show what I wanted to show. All I wanted to show you was if you type in any browser, hanford.gov, go to the events calendar in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll notice that we are not only running this comment period, but we're also running a 45-day comment period on the life cycle and cost and scope. And we would love to get your comments on both of those. And so we just want to make sure that you put your comments in on the life cycle if you want to, or for this cleanup request. But just as we're going along, I know that was mentioned by our regulators and wanted to make sure we didn't have any confusion. We're running two different comment periods, one on the life cycle cost and scope, and this is on the Hanford cleanup priorities, and we love your comments on both of them. And so with that, now let's get right to our questions. Colleen, Who do we have in queue first, please?
First in queue, we have Dwayne Schmoker, and his question is the 7 million added to the original 10 million that Congress provided for TBI in 2020? In short, how much money is now available for the off-site disposal initiative? And so that's from Dwayne Schmoker.
So thanks for that question. And basically, your math is correct that 7 million in this appropriation we're showing would complete the funding necessary to complete the TBI phase 2 2,000-gallon demonstration. And we're currently working the waste incidental reprocessing process, followed by NEPA documentation, and then ultimately we'll be in discussions with the state on the permit. So that's the final piece of funding for that work scope for phase 2 of what has been called the test bed initiative.
Thank you, Delmar. And anything further from our regulators to provide that answer?
No, nothing further.
All right, thank you. And then for those of you that are joining us via the phone only and you're not on the Teams meeting, hit *6 to unmute, and we'd love to hear you. If there is someone who would like to ask a question on the phone. All right, not hearing anyone, we'll swing back and check with you. We'll move on to Shelley Simone. Shelley, how are you?
Yeah, Shelley Simone put a question in our chat box, and she says, how much TSCR processed waste will be staged prior to starting DFLAW, and how much room is available?
Good question. If you go back and look at, and I don't know if you got the slides available, slide 7, we are staging the TSCR treated waste in AP 106, which is one of our double shell tanks next to WTP, and our intention to have 1 million gallons staged prior to WTP entering hot commissioning. And then we'll continue to operation as they start treatment operations to maintain that, and then look at additional capabilities to maintain that treatment in the future. So AP 106 and 1 million gallons.
Thank you, Delmar. Any further answer from our regulators?
No further answer.
And Patrick, that's probably a good slide to hold up while we're going through some of the Q&A. And we have Dan Solitz. Hello, Dan. Do you have a question for us?
Yes, I do. Hello and good afternoon. I was wondering if after the waste, the true waste is repackaged, will it immediately be moved to WIP, or is there a delay there? And how long will it take to get that true waste off site once it starts moving?
Yeah, this is Bill Hamill. After it's repackaged, it comes back, and there is a delay in that. And the reason there is after it's repackaged, now it has to be certified, and it needs to go through the certification process. So ultimately, it does go to WIP, but it now has to get into the system. And basically, we have to certify the waste. We have to basically package the waste for shipment. We need to ensure that it meets the revised, what we call the WIP WAC, which is the WIP waste acceptance criteria. So that repackaged waste gets in the queue for certification to go to WIP. So it now gets prioritized in the queue, and you know, our current plan is to start shipping in the 2028 time period. So depending on the package, you know, it could go as early as then, or it might be some time later. But once it's received back from Permafix, it needs to be prepared and ready to go.
All right.
Okay, I thought you negotiated with Ecology for a 2024 shipment date. This is 2028 is when it's going to be start shipping?
2024 is when we actually start the preparations for bringing the certification process, the paperwork, getting our capability to ship to WIP. So we actually, there is a long lead there of time that's needed to basically prepare ourselves to get back up to shipping capacity and the ability to ship. So in 2024, we'll begin the preparations for that.
Thank you.
And John Price, did you have anything further to add with that?
No, I
Or
agree with
Davey?
Bill's answer.
All right, thank you very much. All right, our next question comes from Dan Saras. Hello, Dan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Please
Oh, great.
proceed.
So I just would preface this by saying there are just a couple numbers that jumped out at me about the groundwater, and the 2.5 billion gallons treated is something that, you know, we definitely hope is a high priority for DOE, and we appreciate the stress you put on that in this presentation. There's a couple things that I flag as prelude to a question. One is, you know, we see still over 16 times the drinking water standard for iodine 129 in the 200 area. And I'm curious to know if DOE has any progress on a solution for that problem. It's going to follow probably the same path as tritium. And speaking of tritium, the max concentration in 2020 was over 1 million picocuries per liter in well 699-13-3A. So there are these places, despite the great groundwater treatment, where we still see spikes. For instance, hexavalent chromium jumping in the K area in 2019 and then the H area in 2020, or strontium topping out at 15,700 picocuries per liter in the N area. That's, you know, the standard is 8. And the N area having springs with 48 picocuries per liter right at the shoreline. So all this put together, I guess my question is, you know, when you talk about moving away from the river corridor and being done with that, what are you doing to ensure that these levels, when they do rebound, you're there, you're responsive, and that, you know, when you look at a decision, these 5-year check-ins you do on each record of decision, that they're more than just checking the box and saying, well, yeah, we still have a well there. You know, what triggers you going back in the way you have in some areas and taking a more active cleanup approach? This is a really high priority for our members, for Columbia River, for people all over the region. So groundwater, that big question. And then the second one is just a real simple one. Do you feel confident that you're on pace to meet the WESF? And thank you very much for your presentations. I appreciate all the detail.
Okay, so I'll take the groundwater one first, and there's a lot of activity that we have ongoing in the groundwater, and you know, there's a lot of monitoring and a lot of evaluation on that, and that feeds back into a number of activities that we have. I'm not going to go through every activity, but I will give you a good example of one that you mentioned. You talked about hexavalent chrome. We actually have ongoing, we actually have a soil flushing activity where we're actually washing the soil to expedite the chrome movement through that so that we can capture that in an extraction well. I mean, imagine, if you will, you know, it's kind of, I'm simplifying it a little bit, but put a number of sprinklers over soil and literally washing them to mobilize hexavalent chrome, which is very soluble, and allowing it to be captured downstream. So your question's a very good question. There's a lot of activity that we have ongoing with looking at the contaminants, with looking at the location, with monitoring what the levels are and what the movements are. We have a whole a group in the groundwater report that looks at that, and we also have a whole series of actions, if you will, that are taken with respect to that. So the short answer is yes, we take it very seriously, and there's a lot of activity going on that. With respect to the WESF, we have seen some challenges there with respect to supply chain due to COVID. We have seen some impacts. We are looking to quantify those. We also have an opportunity with renegotiation of the task order with our new contractor, where we're trying to look at the schedule for that. So we are actively working that, but we have seen some minor impacts. We're not at the point where we can quantify those yet, but we do take it very seriously, and that will be a heavy focus of our activities in 22, 23, and 24. as we discussed. So the short answer is we are working to mitigate any impacts there may be out there right now, and we continue to pay a lot of attention to that. And place a lot of focus on that.
Sorry about that. Excuse that.
I get that reaction a lot.
And any other thoughts from Dave Enan or John Price on that?
Sure, I'll answer Dan's question about the radioactive iodine. So the tri-parties recently signed an interim decision to deal with radioactive technetium and uranium in the 200 East area. We don't have a final decision for all contaminants in the 200 East area, and that would be, one of the places we'd worry about iodine and tritium. So those contaminants are really hard to deal with. There's not cost-effective treatment, but we can look at some other remedies like recirculating the water, so you can pump it out downstream and inject it upstream, and radioactive decay will diminish the concentration. So that may be one of the things we look at when we get around to doing the final decision. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Now, we haven't checked in on the people who are just joining us via the phone. If there's anyone here on the phone only, press *6 to unmute, and we'd love to have your question.
Anna, this is
Boy, I
Dan.
heard you there. Just a second. You're cutting in and out, please.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to question. I have one question in general that has come up in some fashion already, and that's about the life cycle scope, schedule, and cost report that's recently been issued. If you look at that report for fiscal 2024, it requires between the low and the high range estimate that's given between $5 billion and nearly $9 billion for funding, and it's required in FY24 in order to meet the milestones and the overall cleanup schedule that DOE plans. But DOE typically is planning their work for cleanup on the current fiscal year appropriation value as a target, which is about, as we just heard this in this presentation, about $2.6 billion. So the question is this: what specific impacts will this much lower funding level have, not only for fiscal 2024, but also for future years on the cleanup of Hanford, being so far below what the life cycle report requires to be provided?
That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, obviously, we operate in a fiscally confined environment. The life cycle baseline is one perspective, is trying to, as some of the speakers talked about, it's, a fairly rough course evaluation of the life cycle to get a range of possibilities. There's a lot of decisions that we, the department, our regulators need to make together to make cleanup decisions to move forward with this cleanup in a risk-informed, safe, and effective manner that open opportunities to complete our mission in a timely manner. We're actively looking at all those options on an ongoing basis to look at opportunities to improve the technologies or our approach, and in our timing of our activities with the regulators' input to execute a effective cleanup. We focus, our efforts with the resources that we have to try to maximize the risk reduction, to maximize the benefits that we provide to the nation, to hopefully continue to get strong support for additional budgets. Frankly, we look at it from how much good can we do with the $2.6 billion that we are getting from the nation, and how do we ensure that's invested wisely versus the other aspect of what we don't have, because quite frankly, it doesn't add a lot of value in terms of planning and how we execute the mission and working with our regulators to achieve our joint objectives of cleanup. We all are interested in doing this mission as quickly as we can, and we do that, with the resources that Congress provides us.
So this is Bill, kind of to add on, you'd asked a question about impacts. One of the things that we try to do to minimize impacts is we try to plan our work in a range where we know we're going to get the funding. You know, we typically plan to a range. You know, we don't know the exact amount until we get it, but we do know that the super high end is probably not realistic, and we also know a super low end is not realistic. So we have an idea in a fairly wide range. Within that, you know, there's certain things we can do to optimize our planning in terms of our people, our processes, how we sequence the work, and we try and maximize that as best we can. And we do that to basically facilitate what amount of money we get. So again, there's certain things that we can do within ranges and we can plan, and we try to do that. We try to optimize, and we're always listening to kind of hear, like you guys are, on what we're going to get. And, you know, once we get that amount of money, we try and pivot very quickly to minimize any, or actually not even minimize, to optimize our planning, because the sooner we know, the easier it is to make those adjustments. So, you know, we do try and watch and plan as wisely as we can, you know, based on ranges and where we think we're going to be at.
And I would offer, just in conclusion, I mean, one of the reasons we're so excited about starting tank waste treatments with Sister and moving forward is, you know, the first and best way to get something done is to start. And we've started waste treatment. We think it's a huge step forward. The next 2 years of moving into WTP DFLAW operations open up a window of opportunities for us, both in demonstrating performance and also opening windows for, you know, single shell treatments and furthering the mission in ways that we didn't have the ability before. So between the work that's been done already by RL and the corridor and where we're trying to get to the next few years in WTP, I think we're going to open up opportunities to safely and effectively begin to minimize the risk to the environment, you know, and the stakeholders that we support.
Starting is exciting. And any further thoughts from our regulators?
Nothing for me.
Can I just verify one additional fact in this line, Dana? Based on John Price's presentation, that a small amount of appropriated funding below the target or the required funding each year can add actually a half a year to the schedule potentially per year. With these massive numbers that are expected to be needed from the life cycle report in the coming years, which are much, much higher than 2.6 billion per year, isn't it fair to say that we're not really talking about realistically wrapping up cleanup, major cleanup activities in the 2078 timeframe? We're probably talking much, much later than that because of the funding deficit. Is that a fair statement?
And I would offer that I don't think it is. And again, I'll use John's line that this is a bit of personal opinion. But, you know, through evaluation, I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to be able to complete the mission in that kind of time period. It'll take us and the regulator and the public working together to find the right level of activity necessary to be successful. And that's what we're all striving to do year by year. You know, 78 is a long time away. And I'll offer an anecdote. My experience, I came from Rocky Flat in the 90s. And in 1998, we had a GAO report that said Rocky was impossible to close. It would cost us $100 billion, and that was 20 years ago, and take 70 years. We were done 8 years later. Now, we're not Rocky, and the scenario is dramatically different, but the first step was to start the cleanup, and that's how Rocky proceeded. And I think what we're excited about here with the tank waste mission and what we're doing is we're starting tank waste treatment and opening those doors to find those solutions. Time will tell. But today, investing the resources we get to the best of our abilities to cause a maximum risk reduction, we believe is in the government's best interest. It gets us the support and in the community's best interest, and that's what we're trying to do to the best of our
Great.
ability.
Well, I really appreciate that anecdote. It does help. Thank you very much.
All right, and I don't want anyone to feel impatient. We're getting right to you. Next in queue, we have Kelsey Shank. She's a journalist with The Edge, followed by Jerry Paulette. Liz Matson is in queue, followed by Jerry Yorioka. So we'll begin with Kelsey. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dana. My question is for DOE. I was wondering if with the increase in funding for the high-level waste facility over the next few years, if the analysis of alternatives, the AOA, will be wrapped up this year and if it will be shared publicly.
Yeah, this is Roger. I have not been participating directly on the AOA, but it's my understanding it is supposed to be completed later this year. I don't have a schedule to present or to share it at this time, but I can get that. And I think that's regardless of whether or not with the funding increase or not. So that's the my understanding right now.
Thank you.
Any further thought from our regulators? All right, that moves us on to Jerry Paulette. Let's hear your question, Jerry.
Thank you. I would start with a note that the reason Rocky Flats was able to be cleaned up on a greatly accelerated pace was the agreement by Washington State, Oregon, and the public with public support to allow for Rocky Flats to be cleaned up and prioritized in the budget along with other sites, with a promise that has never been fulfilled that the funding level from those sites when they closed down and were cleaned up would be moved to the sites that remained. And that's the point of institutional memory that the Department of Energy is seeking to remove from the Hanford Advisory Board, for example, with its proposals to gut the board. And I just want to point out as a point of institutional memory that that was the commitment. It was a formal commitment. That was the agreement we sacrificed here for years and had reduced budgets so that Rocky Flats and other sites could be cleaned up with a commitment that was never honored to put the funding into Hanford when those sites were cleaned up. My question is starting with for Ecology, and John to answer with an appreciation of your detailed evaluation of the budget. Does Ecology expect that the Energy Department will have funds to meet legal obligations to empty leaking high-level waste tanks, starting with B109? I note that March 24th, 9 days from today, marks 2 years since the monitoring data disclosed the massive drop in liquid in B109. So what is Ecology's expectation that there will be funding for removal of wastes from leaking tanks? And what the heck is the point of saying that a priority is risk reduction for tanks if it doesn't include stopping a leak?
And I hope the second part of your question was for DOE. So
that is, yes, it indeed. I wrote it down for USDOE, and thank you, John. It is indeed for USDOE, which said its priority was risk reduction. Thanks.
yeah, thanks for always giving me the easy questions too, Jerry. So, well, as you know, B109 is under active discussion between Ecology and DOE. So I'm not going to say anything more specifically about that, but I think, have a pretty good general answer for you, which is Ecology's expectation is that DOE will not be limited by funding for work that we require them to do, either by TPA milestones or by a standalone administrative order. And that ideal is actually in paragraph 153 of the TPA, which says that Ecology does not acknowledge lack of appropriated funds as a reason not to comply with the tri-party agreement. And DOE also reserves the right to contest that assertion by Ecology. But, you know, as you know, at commercial facilities, we expect commercial facilities to do whatever they need to do. They're supposed to have, you know, closure cost funds in place through, you know, an enforceable financial instrument. We don't have the same provision with DOE, but our expectation is they're going to have the money to do whatever we require them to do. Thanks.
Thank you. What about US DOE?
As John shared with you, we are continuing to work with the Department of Ecology on the response, and part of this conversation is to solicit your input on priorities, and I think this is a good example of input on priorities.
Well, if I'm giving input on priorities, it's dang well better have some money in FY23 to respond and start action, because we know it's feasible. So that's the input, and that's the time, you know, at this point, thousands of people have sent in comments to the state and to US DOE urging action, and 2 years of inaction.
All right, our next commenter is Liz Matson, up to ask a question. Thank you, Jerry. Liz?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, they hear you just fine.
I know we're not seeing FY24 budget numbers, which is an ongoing challenge for all of us trying to understand what the local field office is going to be submitting for their budget request before it goes to OMB and then the president. It seems like the life cycle scope schedule cost report gives us a hint at what should be requested. Are the local field offices planning to request funding consistent with the life cycle scope schedule cost report for FY24?
Yeah, this is Bill. The department requests a compliant budget, and we do that as part of the submittal. That is the process. The life cycle cost report is part of the consideration that goes into that request, but it's not the only factor that goes into that request. But we do submit a compliant budget request.
All right, Liz, did that answer your question? Okay. Now our next,
sorry. I guess, sorry, Dana, just one other follow-up. What are the other factors other than the life cycle report that go into that request? If you could elaborate on that.
When we look at a compliant budget request, we have to look at it basically what work has been completed to date. I mean, for example, that report changes the second it's finalized and we do additional work. Now some of the assumptions in that report may be outdated. So we have to look at, when we submit the request at that point in time, where we're at with what work's been conducted to date, what we anticipate our budget planning may be in the year following that, because remember, we're on a 2-year cycle, so we're actually always 2 years out. So again, we have to look at the state of the site, we have to look at things like this report. There's a number of things that we have to evaluate. We basically have to make any budget request that we put in as current as possible at the time that we submit it. So hopefully that helps. One of the things that you had mentioned also, just kind of make sure that we're clear on the purpose of this briefing. As you said, that you weren't seeing the FY24 budget numbers, and that's primarily because this is the beginning of the cycle. This input is part of that, so we don't have 24 numbers yet. You know, we have not submitted anything. We're trying to get public input so that we can actually be part of that, so that I can be part of that cycle. So just wanted to make sure we're clarifying that.
Yeah, I think the last time we saw numbers was in 2013 from RL, and I don't think we saw numbers from ORP in 2013, but we did used to see those numbers prior to the submission, which was helpful to see, you know, what the field offices were considering. So I'm hopeful that someday we might return to that level of detail. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Liz. Our next question is Gerald Yorioka. So, apology if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. Go ahead.
And I can start with his question. I'm not sure if he's still on the line, so feel free to jump on if you, I think I see you. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, my question was, assuming, which may not be true, that the outer wall of a double tank would fail before the inner wall. So my question is there some methodology that you use to check the integrity of the outer wall on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, a good question. We have an extensive tank integrity program within the tank farms, you know, working with Ecology, and we have a whole suite of inspection and monitoring and chemistry control techniques that we use to monitor our double shell tanks. For the double shell tanks, we have that access in the annulus, which is between the primary shell and the secondary shell. So we have a whole suite of robotics. A lot of them are magnetic robotics that can remotely crawl into the spaces to do non-destructive testing, UT, sampling, and visual inspection. We even have devices that we can crawl up the air slots in the bottom of the tank, which are really 2 by 2 inches slots under the tanks to do some limited inspections there. So we actively do that. A lot of active visual and chemistry inspections as part of our tank integrity program, physical inspections, and that's a large part of the tank farm base operations to support those activities. We also have a standing independent tank expert panel that we consult with and continue to pull in, you know, technologies and opportunities across, you know, all commercial industries to bring more and more tools in. We have 3 or 4 additional inspection technologies under development. Actually, we're working with WSU and a couple of them. We also are investing some funding for looking at the abilities to repair and or add materials to the existing tanks. You know, all those are all very, very preliminary. You know, nothing is operational there, but we are doing those investigations as well. So, yeah, we have a very active set of inspections specifically on the double shell tanks, and that annulus space gives us access to monitor both the primary shell and the secondary shell. The SSTs, we have visual inspections. Without that annulus, you know, the physical inspections with the crawlers is not available, but we have a separate program for those as well.
Thank you.
Any further thoughts from our regulators? All right, just to be respectful of everyone's time, we're coming up to 7 o'clock. We started at 5:30. The presentations took a little more than 30 minutes, so we've been receiving questions for about 40 minutes. We have answered all the first questions of those who are here, both on the phone and in the queue. We have 3 more second questions, one from Dwayne Schumacher, one from Jerry Paulette, and one from Shelley Simone. Is everyone all right if we continue on just to answer those 3 questions, and then we'll conclude? And does that
Yes, please.
sound all right for the members of the public?
Yeah, Ecology's good to stay.
Thank you. I'd like to check with everyone. People have sometimes urgent commitments. So It's time now for Dwayne Schumacher for your second question. Please go ahead.
And while he's unmuting, I'm not sure if he's still on the line, so I'll start with your question and feel free to jump in, because this was circling back towards the beginning. He says, what is the schedule to bring the 242A evaporator back online? Can AAX single shell tank retrievals continue without the evaporator being operational? If so, can we complete AAX retrievals without the evaporator?
Thank you for reading that for me.
Sure.
I appreciate it.
So the base question, the 242A evaporator, yes, we're bringing it back in. We're actively, so just to give everybody a little bit of context, we're replacing transfer lines, double encased transfer lines between the evaporator and the AW farm, which is where the evaporator pulls and feeds back to, and doing a whole series of ongoing upgrades to the facility. The construction of the transfer lines is ongoing. In fact, we have the traffic roadblock because we got the roadblock to trace the lines right next to the evaporator. We are anticipating having the evaporator up and finishing the operational readiness for you and being back in operation this fiscal year. So that's the plan. And yeah, we can continue with the AX farm, but as we move into A farm, obviously we will need the evaporator to continue to move forward with retrievals. And for the audience, just so you understand, we add water to the single shell tanks as part of the retrieval process to be able to mobilize it and pump it out. And we put that into the double shell tanks and store it there. And the evaporator is a tool by which we, through permitted processes, remove that water back out and manage our double shell tank space. So the operations is back up, anticipated to be operational, and the physical upgrades are progressing well. We're nearing beginning to get into the finishing the line installations. And so we do not see any impact to the retrieval system, but yeah, at some point we need the evaporator back up to continue to make space for continuing single shell tank retrievals because of the water addition supporting retrievals. Each of these retrievals, we have a water balance that we manage to. We just finished the third of 4 tanks in AX farm, and we're pretty much performing on our assumptions in terms of water usage and management. And as I mentioned, we finished AX 103 just literally about 3 weeks ago, at least to the limits of the technology, and we'll be continuing that process and anticipate beginning AX 104, which we don't need the evaporator for probably September, October of this year. Hope that answered the question.
Yes, and regulator perspective?
Nothing on that one.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this brings us to...
Yeah, and next is Jerry Paulette. He said that I could just read his question. Can you let us know if you'll update budget figures online when there is a congressional request? So that was from Jerry.
When there's a congressional request.
Yeah, can you let us know if you'll update the budget figures online when there's a congressional request?
I mean, the times that we can update those will be in the process is we'll put our information in. The president will submit his budget, and that's really the public release of those numbers.
So if the question is when the president's budget request comes out, yes, we can do that. What we can't do is anything prior to that, because that is all falls under the embargoed umbrella. But when the president's budget comes out, that's made public. And actually, everybody reads about that anyways. I mean, that's kind of well known.
Right, and the next major place where that rolls out is after Congress completes their magic and we get an appropriation, hopefully, versus a continuing resolution like this year.
Yeah, knock on wood.
All right, and then one final question from Shelley Simone.
And so, Shelley, as you're unmuting, I can get started on your question. Shelley says, when can we expect to see budgets start to address what are essentially orphan waste, ion exchange columns, for example, and getting them to ultimate disposition?
Okay, well, first off, I would not call the ion exchangers, I'm assuming you're referring to TISCR, and when you're talking ion exchanger, that is not an orphan waste. From either department's perspective, and I'll let Ecology speak for themselves. But that's a waste form where we remove the cesium, and it's in a much safer and secure location than in the mobile liquids in the double shell tanks. And per the milestones we put in place and the permitting processes in place, we'll continue to work with the state on the appropriate disposition. There are several options, so I think at least in RCRA space, the term orphan has some specific meanings, and it's not orphan in that sense. But there is some options for disposition, and we'll be working with the state through that, either through disposal, treatment through high-level waste, or continued storage on the pad. So that's an ongoing discussion we'll have, and there's some milestones associated with that as well.
Yeah, and I
If
can
there's
add.
Go ahead.
I agree with what Delmar said. I'll just add a little more detail. So the milestones you want to look at are the M-62-60, -61, and -62 milestones. The -60 milestone has DOE turning in a report to Ecology in 2026 about their disposition pathway for those capsules. The milestone itself identifies vitrification of those materials in the waste treatment plant as the baseline scenario. So I agree with Delmar. So in terms of your question, when would we expect to see budget? We'd expect to see budget for that report in 2026. And then in 2029, DOE has to give us a permit modification that describes the treatment and disposal. And then in 2035, they have to negotiate milestones for disposal. So those milestones would drive the funding request to answer your specific question.
Any other? All right. Now, we have answered all the questions of the participants in chat. We've called to the phone twice. And before we conclude, let me just see if there are any more questions. Anyone on the phone? *6. Anyone in the queue? We can take one last question or two before we conclude. I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity.
Dana, this is Tom Galliotto. If I can ask a quick one.
Can anybody?
Hello?
Hello?
I can hear you. Go ahead. Oh, it sounds like we have.
Oh. This is Rose Ferry with Yakima Nation. And I don't really have a question, but I do have a comment. And can everybody hear me okay?
I hear you just fine. Please go right ahead.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Anyway, I do have a comment, and I've seen a couple of these presentations earlier in the day, and it was very nice to get on tonight and be able to see the regulator perspectives on these presentations. But I also been just very patiently listening to a lot of the questions and comments and whatnot, and it occurred to me that some of the folks on the phone, such as Jerry Paulette and Heart of America and Riverkeeper, some of those folks that are Shelley Simone are they've got the institutional knowledge to ask these very good questions. They've been around a long time. And something that Jerry said earlier really struck home with me, and that is, I'm hoping that, John, I'm hoping you're tuning into this and taking it up where you need to, as well as folks with DOE. It is a travesty to have some of these people not being able to continue on in the HAB board. We've gotten some notifications and they're very disturbing. And I sit and listen to the institutional knowledge that these people have, that they contribute to a public advisory board. And I really wanted to say that. And I really hope that you guys consider very clearly as to what can be done to not let these people be eliminated from a board that desperately needs their knowledge, both institutionally and technically. Anyway, I just wanted to respond to what Jerry had said, and I wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. We appreciate the comment. And
Dana, can I also ask a question?
Please, go ahead, Tom. I appreciate it. Tom,
Thank you. This is Tom Galliotto again. I think I've got a simple question, but it might be difficult to answer. What does DOE plan to discuss, or when does DOE plan to discuss the Hanford tank waste reclassification effort with the public at Hanford so that adequate time is provided for a thorough and open public discussion to evaluate the pros and cons of that change? There's a lot of interest in that in the HAB, and it's ongoing, but we're uncertain as to when we'll have the opportunity to really address the issues and have presentations on that.
Okay, I'm assuming when you say the reclassification, you're referring to the Federal Register notice and the interpretation of the high-level waste definition. Is that a good assumption?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, I mean, in the short version, the position for us in this site is that we're not using that in the near term, and I believe part of the process at our, at the corporate perspective was to make that commitment to some duration before we would use it. So, right now we have no specific near-term plans to implement or use that. I'm not saying that we won't at some point in the future. So we really aren't in those discussions. That process notice is being applied in other sites other than Hanford at this point, but not here.
Okay. Okay.
So we're not in active discussion.
I appreciate that comment. Just the main point there is to make sure we have allowed with DOE enough time for public discussion and involvement in that decision process. And I will mention,
I believe both. Sorry, I was going to say I just believe both ourselves and I think the state, our regulators understand that and are aware of that desire.
Okay. Very good. And I wanted to add my support to the last caller about the importance of the institutional knowledge on the HAB. I think it's critical. But thank you.
And we have one last quick question.
Yeah, I think this will wrap it up just because Maya Burke had a quick question and some other people wanted her to get that question answered. Can you explain what you mean when you say compliant in regard to requesting a compliant budget? So is that compliant according to who? Is it US DOE or what does a compliant budget mean?
Yeah, this is John Price, and I put an answer in the chat. So from Ecology's perspective, a compliant budget request is one that will complete all requirements, whether they're from TPA milestones, from permit requirements, or anything else on time. So that's our definition.
Ours would be very similar. It would be on time or as soon as possible, practically possible, because there may be certain things, depending on where you're at a point in time where you run into work densities or something. But ours is very similar with the caveat that it's done safely, of course, and practically that it can be done.
All right, thank you. This was a pleasure of a meeting with the knowledge that was present. I'm showing roughly 55 participants, the majority being public, some staff. As we have discussed 2 comment periods tonight. Tonight we're talking about the Hanford cleanup priorities, and you can find that on the events calendar. There was also some mention from our regulators about the life cycle cost and scope comment period that's also going on. Those will both conclude April 15th, so you still have about a month. And when you look on the events calendar, please be sure to consider the one that you want to add your comments to make sure they're going to the right email box. So on behalf of DOE, we want to thank everyone. Colleen Drinkard will be dropping a survey in the chat. If you take a minute, help us know how we did, how we can improve. We'd sure appreciate it. So with that, I wish you a very good night.